Welcome to another edition of GTN Coaches Corner, where we answer all your questions about triathlon. Remember, you can leave your questions in the comment section down below. Use the hashtag GTN Coaches Corner, and we could be answering your question next week. This week, we actually have a special guest to help us answer the questions, both from a pro perspective and also from a coach perspective. Ruth Astle, thanks for joining us.
No problem. Hopefully I've got some expert answers.
Well, you are a coach and a pro. You've got 4 athletes here racing Kona this week?
Yeah, 4 age group athletes out racing, so that's great to be able to see them.
So we've got an actual pro and an actual coach here to answer our questions, unlike what you normally have, which is an ex-pro and a sort of coach. So, right, let's get into the questions. Starting with this one, Nick Van Dam says, hashtag GTN Coaches Corners. I'm back in triathlon after a multi-year hiatus. I've completed a 70.3, but very late in the bike, I started to feel pins and needles in one of my feet. I'm using an old bike from years ago and I haven't changed the fit. I did add power meter pedals. Could this be the issue? Is the solution getting a bike fit, or could it be something else? My concern is I don't know if the solution works until 50 plus miles into the ride.
So I think bike fit can definitely be part of it if you're getting things like pins and needles. But I think there's things you can do yourself before going for an official bike fit. So you can, a lot of the time, the main thing they're going to look at is your saddle height. So you can go for like either lowering it a bit, probably would be what I'd start with. And maybe try that on a training ride. So, like, I assume you're probably doing a couple of training rides that are that length if you're doing a 70.3. The other thing to look at, I would say, is also your shoes.
Yeah.
Like I used to get, especially in hotter conditions where your feet swell a little bit, then your shoes get a bit tighter. So whilst they might have felt fine training,
When you started, yeah.
then you kind of get uncomfortable feet. So I think those are probably the two that I'd start with. And then if you're still struggling, like maybe go and get a proper bike fit and get someone to look at you.
Yeah, I would say if they started when you put new power meter pedals on, most likely it's something to do with either the shoes or the cleats. So as Ruth says, make sure you're not over tightening those shoes and cutting off the blood supply as your feet swell. And then if that doesn't solve it, you can play with the pedal position underneath, the cleat position underneath those shoes, but that might be getting into proper bike position, bike setup territory, because if you move your cleats forward or back, you also need to adjust your saddle height a little bit, so probably worthwhile getting an expert's opinion on that. Okay, on to our next question, and this comes from Stretch. Stretch says, hashtag GTN Coaches Corner, what is a normal fluctuation in weight week to week?
Ooh. So I think this depends a little bit if you're a man or a woman. I'd say as a woman, you generally, well, for me anyway, again, it's very individual, but a woman generally will fluctuate a bit more with hormones, because you have like different water retention in particular is the one thing. I think also it obviously depends on how you're training, how close you're getting to racing. Like I'd say off season for me, I'm probably 3-4 kilos heavier than I would be coming up to a race. But I would say week on week, I could also fluctuate by 1 to 2 kilos, depending on if I've had a particularly big meal, if I'm just feeling a bit bloated, if it's the wrong time of the month. Like there's all sorts of things like that that affect it. So yeah, I think it's very normal to fluctuate quite a lot, as long as you have I think as long as you know you're eating the same and there's not like an underlying issue that causes you to massively drop quite quickly.
Yeah.
But I think most people would fluctuate sort of a couple of kilos probably.
Yeah. 1 to 2 kgs I think is probably
Yeah.
pretty normal week on week. If it's more than that, you need to look at make sure you're not under eating or overhydrating or underhydrating, you're not chronically dehydrated or something like that. But yeah, 1 to 2 kgs is pretty normal. You need to kind of track your weight over a few weeks to get a trend and make sure that you're not losing or gaining too much. The fluctuation week on week is not going to tell you too much if you just measure once and then one more week later on.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on to our next question, and it's from Anton Vignon, and he says, hashtag GTN Coaches Corner. Thanks for all the great tips and content. After completing my first 70.3, I'm now training for 140.6 for next year. As a time crunched athlete, how important are very long bike rides, i.e. 6 hours plus, versus normal long rides of 3.5 to 4 hours in the last few weeks before the event? Thanks in advance.
It's very rare that I do a 6 hour plus ride.
Yeah, I was going to say that too. I mean, the 6.5 hour plus rides are actually not required at all for an Ironman.
No.
Yeah.
I think as long as I think for a time crunch athlete, you can get away with doing 3 to 4 hour rides, but I'd say probably just add a bit of intensity to them. I think the only reason for doing longer than that is if mentally you want to have done the distance, or if mentally, if you know it's like, say, a hard course with loads of hills, you want to have done one ride to have that time on the bike. But yeah, I don't give my athletes generally more than that unless they're like desperate to do it, in which case I caveat it with I don't need you to do this. This is your choice.
Yeah, if you do this, I absolve myself of any responsibility.
Exactly.
You don't have to do a 6-hour ride. As Ruth says, I agree with her on that one. There is some advantage to going out once, doing a super big day, just to give yourself that mental confidence that you can do it on race day, but you don't need to as far as training goes. If you're a time crunched athlete, 3.5 to 4 hours for your long ride is more than enough, and you can build that as you go through the season. You can add some intensity and you will be ready for that Ironman. One other thing I will say as a tip for the time crunched athlete is you can alternate. You don't have to do a very long ride every weekend. You can alternate. You can do a long ride one weekend and a shorter ride the next weekend with more intensity. If you are time crunched, that's a good way of getting around these long rides and fitting them into your schedule.
Yeah.
Okay, next question, and it's from Tosh Pierce, and she says, "Hi all, love the channel. I've only been doing triathlons for 2 years. This summer was my first real season competing in an event series, local races, and my first 70.3. I have many plans and goals, but it was too spread out this year, and I became mentally fatigued and bored. My question is, how do you plan 2023 race season constructively and sensibly?" I think they're trying to get a pattern on how the season should look, so that they're not just picking races for 12 months and calling it a season.
Yeah, so I think for me, like race planning, depends a bit what you're trying to get out of it, right? So I think you need to be really clear, what are my goals? Like, is it a particular bucket list race that you want to do? Is it you want to go podium somewhere? You know, so I think be really clear on what is your goal for the season. I think then you can kind of pick what your like A race or your couple of A races might be, and then kind of plan around that. Because I think for most
Good
people,
advice.
you can probably like be at your absolute peak for 2 races a year, like maybe only even one if you've got loads of other stuff going on. And then you probably want like a couple of practice races just to check you know what you're doing, practice some of the transitions and stuff. So yeah, I think if you have your goals, then you can pick your like top races and kind of work around that.
Yeah, good advice. I absolutely agree with that. I think you probably find that lots of age groupers kind of get caught up in the, oh, this is available, I could do this one. This is an exciting one coming up in 3 weeks. This is an exciting one coming up in 6 weeks. And then their season just becomes this jumble of one race after the other. And by the end of the season, they've done all of the races, but they never really focus on any one of them. So,
yeah. Although
good
I would
advice.
equally say, if you just love racing,
Yeah.
just do all the races.
Jump
like again,
in,
it comes back to what's your goal. If your goal is I love racing, I want to race all the time with my friends, just do that.
Don't take that away by focusing on something in 8 months' time. Yeah, I agree. Okay, one more question, and it's from Quinn Stevenson. And he says, "My coach says I should have an easy week every 3rd week, but my friend's program has an easy week every 4th week. It feels like they're training more than me. Which is better?"
This is the classic age group mentality game of I always need to do more.
Exactly.
And to be fair, I think like I sometimes feel that as a pro, like you see all the social media of what everyone else is doing, you're like, oh, I need to do more. More is definitely not always better. I think actually for most people, especially age groupers, when you've got work, you've got family, you've got so many other stresses in your life, actually less is generally better. And I think as long as you're being sort of efficient with your training and there's like a good mix of intensity and aerobic stuff, actually I don't think it matters that much, kind of like the overall hours. Like, unless say you're training for an Ironman and you're doing like 3 hours a week, you might want to do a bit more. But I think generally speaking, like if your coach, and again it depends if you're having one-to-one coaching, if it's just a generic plan, but if it's one-to-one, I would probably have the trust in your coach that they know what they're doing. If not, it's probably time to change coaches. But yeah, I think it can be very individual what people respond to. Some people need more rest. So,
but more is not better. Your friend only having a rest week every 4th week is not necessarily going to be fitter than you on race day. So make sure you're doing what's right for you, and trust your coach. That's what they're there for. Thank you very much for joining us, Ruth. Really appreciate it, especially on the eve of the Ironman World Champs. We wish you all the best for the race, and hopefully you'll be joining us again soon on a Coach's Corner.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.